Hi there, my name is Dean from Aerobics First, ski shop in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Here to talk about some basics on boot fitting. Most people's problem when they're going skiing is uncomfortable feet, so we want to help you with that to make sure that you get some comfy feet that perform really well. So our ski boots are a hard plastic shell, like this, that has a foam liner in it. So you have a comfortable liner put into a plastic shell that is really cold when you get out in the wintertime, and you put a bony foot in there. That gives you a really hard time to get a comfortable fit. So our job as boot fitters is to make sure that this fits in this really well. So some of the basics that we want to talk about are length, width, flex in a ski boot, how to judge what's going to perfectly work for you on the ski hill no matter where you're skiing and what conditions you're skiing in. So some of the main questions that we want to ask somebody is what kind of skier that they rate themselves as, what kind of aggressiveness they ski at, and also how often you ski. Those little questions give us some feedback so we can better suit a boot to those kinds of skiers. So what we want to do at first is talk about what we want to put inside the ski boot. One important thing before we even get started on getting a boot on your foot is to make sure that you have the proper sock to make sure that that boot is going to fit the best it can fit. So what a lot of people do is they'll just use a basic cotton sock, which is not the best. Cotton is a nice natural fiber, but what it does is it soaks up all the moisture, keeps the moisture inside the boot, better chance of cold feet. So what we want to look at is trying to keep that foot as warm as possible and also dry. So the two options are either a synthetic sock or you can get into a merino wool. Synthetic is really good because it's a man-made fiber, wicks moisture away to keep your foot dry. That moisture goes into the liner. Works pretty well, but doesn't have as much warming properties as it should. When you jump into a merino wool, wool has properties where when it gets wet, it gets warm. It holds that heat in it. So with a merino wool sock, it wicks away moisture a little bit, then also it keeps a little bit of that moisture in the sock to keep your foot a little bit warmer. So this is a starting point. The other thing with a weighted sock, you don't want a sock that's too thick. You either want a fairly thin sock or a medium weight sock. There's only so much room in that boot to start with, so we want to make sure that you have enough insulation on that sock to make things better. But also on the other side, we want to make sure that you're as close to the shell as possible for performance reasons. So from there, what we do is we'll take a boot, we'll fit you in with a measuring device like this. So how we do it is looking at left foot and right foot. We sit you down, take a look at what your length is when you're seated, and also what the width is of your foot. And then we'll get you to stand up and see how your foot changes from left foot to right foot. Typically when you stand up, there's a change in your foot. When you're unweighted to a weighted position, this will actually move slightly. So this will give us an idea how flexible your feet are, so we have a better chance of making sure that the width is proper in the boot and also the length is proper in the boot. When we start looking at your foot, we look at the shape of your foot in terms of width, length, and also the flexibility of that foot too. So when you're seated, your arch will be in a certain position, and when you stand, that foot will have some flexion in it. So what we do is look at how your foot moves. That'll give us an idea how your foot is going to move inside the boot. So what we look at for measurement, we look at this length to make sure that we get you in the right length of boot. But then from there, we look at hot spots that are going to give us maybe some problems when we look at your foot, when you get into that plastic boot. So what we look at is both sides of the width of the foot. If there's any bunions, bunionettes here, depending on where this bone is here. If you have a really wide foot, we look at that part of the foot. If you have a high instep, that's going to give us some issues. That's going to be a lower instep boot. And then we also look at your ankles, how big your ankles are. That's pretty much the thing when we look at your foot to make sure that when we put your foot in the boot and look at that shell, it's going to match up pretty good. So when we're sitting down looking at your foot, what we're trying to do is assess what kind of foot type you have to make sure that we have the best chance of making sure that that foot fits well into that ski boot. So what we generally do is look at what the length of your foot is and also the width of your foot to make sure that the proper width and arch height is going to fit that foot. Generally, the hot spots on that foot that we really look at is the width. So if you have a bunion, a bunionette, any protrusions on this side of the foot, And then also what we do is look at your ankles. If you have a fairly good size ankle or a smaller size ankle. What these generally are the hot spots, the main hot spots that we look for to make sure that if we need to do any manipulation on the shell. So when we get into the boot fitting process, we make sure that we do that beforehand. So when you put your foot in the shell, it's going to be the best chance of being comfortable. So the first thing to do when you're getting ski boots fitted is to check to see what size your feet are. So what you want to do is be seated with a good pair of ski socks on to give you a good sense of how much volume is going to be in the boot. So what we want to do is measure the length first to see the difference between your feet if one foot is shorter than the other, and also to see the pure length of your foot when it's unweighted. So then what we'll do is get you to stand up. Then what we want to do is check and see what the difference is on your feet when you stand up and get in a weighted position. For most feet, there is a little bit of flexibility in the foot, so when you start to put weight on it, there is a slight foot change in terms of length and also width. So then what we want to do is see how much change there is, see the difference between your left foot and the right foot, if one foot is a little bit longer than the other, because that will cue us to make sure that we fit the longer foot first, because the shorter foot will be an easier foot to fit. Then what we also want to do is check the width of the foot to see what kind of volume we need in the boot to make sure that that foot is going to sit properly in a weighted position. So what this does is it tells us in millimeters. His foot measures a 95 millimeter width and also a 97. So what that tells us is in ski boots these days, just like shoes, you can get them in different volumes. So in ski boots, the lower the number, the narrower the boot is, the higher number, the wider the boot is. So as the number gets bigger, up to 110, the wider the foot. So when you're matching the foot to the boot, the last of the foot, so his foot is measuring a 97 millimeter last, so this boot comes in a 98, which means that's how wide the boot is. So what we want to do is match up the foot with the boot. So you want to make sure if it's a narrow foot, you're putting a narrow foot in a narrow boot. There's many different sizes and shapes in ski boots these days. They fit similar to shoes in terms of volume, so you want to make sure that your starting point is going to be as close to perfect as possible. Okay, so after you measure the foot, what you want to do is get the foot in the shell to check to see how that foot measures in the shell. So what you want to do, remove the liner and do a shell check. So what you want to do is get that foot in the shell. Okay, stand up, just barely touch your toes against the front of that shell. Then what you want to make sure is you do a shell check to make sure that you have 2 fingers from the heel to the back of the shell. This gives you the appropriate amount of volume because the foam shell that goes inside the liner after a while packs out. So what this does is it just checks to make sure that you have the proper length at a starting point where the foam is as thick as it's going to be until it breaks down. Then after you do your length check, what you want to do is move the heel back right into the heel and check the ankles. So what you want to make sure is the ankle on the inside and outside of the foot is not actually sitting on the shell. If that foot is flexible enough where your inside ankle is sitting on the shell, what that will tell you is you will have to do some shell manipulation before you actually get into any boot fitting. So this is your starting point to make sure that the shell actually fits the foot properly. Then we'll get the liner in to actually check the flex and the volume of the shell. So after we measure your foot, what we want to do is get you in the shell. One important thing to always remember is you want to open up the shell on a 45-degree angle. It makes it a lot easier for yourself to get in and out of the boot. There's a strap that they put on the tongue nowadays, so when you open it up in this fashion, it's a lot easier to get in the boot and also to pull the boot off. So what we want to do is when we get you in the boot, first things first is that boot is probably going to feel small, your toes touching. There's a lot of foam in the back of the boot that prematurely pushes you into the front of the boot. So this is where a lot of people get into trouble. As soon as your toe touches, a lot of people think it's too small. This is a perfect position to start from. The boot is actually a really good fit at this point. So then what we'll do is we'll buckle you into that boot and start to pull your heel back into that heel cup so we can really get a good sense of where your toe is going to end up. So now what we'll want to do is we'll want to get you flexing in the boot, and what that tries to achieve for us is that foot is starting to move back in that heel so you get right into the heel cup. So then what we'll do is we'll get a sense of where that toe is ending up. We'll buckle up the boot. So when you're standing up straight, your toes should be touching the end, either brushing or, really touching. Then when you flex forward, your toe is going to come off. This is a perfect starting point in terms of length for a ski boot. You want to make sure that your toes are touching when you're standing up straight in a brand new boot. If your toes do not touch, always remember this foam liner that's inside of the boot, it's going to pack out and it's going to give you more volume in that boot and a little bit more length. So this is where a lot of people get into trouble, where they end up with a boot that's too big. They start by thinking the boot is a little bit too short. So always remember, your toes touching when you're standing. When you flex forward, your toe comes off. Then what we'll look at is we'll look at the actual volume of your foot. So we'll get you wearing it around to make sure that you have good width here and here. This is a really important part of the boot that knocks a lot of people off the hill. Typical hot spots are under your first and second buckle, right from these bones here, and also some people, men and women, who have bunions on the other side of the foot. So what we look at after you have the boot on for a little while to see if we have to do any shell manipulation by actually knocking that shell out to give that part of the foot a little bit more volume. The other thing too is that we always look for instep height to make sure that your instep is actually the right height, where you don't have too much pressure on that part of your foot. If you do, there's little tricks that we can do by shaving the boot board that's underneath the liner. So what that does is drop your heel a little bit, takes the pressure off this part of your foot. So it's two parts. What we look at is your foot at first to make sure that your foot is actually comfortable in the boot. Then we'll look at, from a performance point of view, is actually how the boot flexes. So then what we'll want you to do is get flexing the boot up and down. So what we want to do is make sure that your pivot and your ankle is moving properly. What this does is it allows your body to stay over your foot so you can stay in the sweet spot of the boot. What a lot of people end up happening is getting into a boot that's too stiff. So what happens is you don't get to leverage this pivot point. You always want to make sure that you can pivot at your ankles, knees, and hips to make sure that you can actually spring action over your foot to make sure you stay in that sweet spot of your foot. So these are the key components when you actually have a boot on to make sure that you have the best chance of being on the slopes, that your foot is going to be comfortable, and you have good performance coming out of that boot so you can really see what your ski is doing. So last but not least, after we do the general boot fitting, get you in the boot, seeing if there's any manipulating of the shell that we need to do, what we look at is we look at footbeds. So generally speaking, when you take a liner out of the boot, take the insole out, this is what you end up with. It's a fairly thin foam, easily compressed. It gives a little bit of warmth and thermal properties to the boot, but it doesn't give you any kind of support or stability inside the boot. So what we want to do is check to see if a footbed, either an over-the-counter footbed or a custom-fitted footbed, is going to benefit your foot. So what we do is we look at something like this, which is an over-the-counter or off-the-shelf kind of footbed that you can heat, and it is moldable. But what this does is it gives you a good arch support and also a heel cup. So what it does is gives you a good base of platform inside that boot. So when you're weighting and unweighting, your foot is not changing as much as it would on a flat piece of foam. So what this does is give you a better base of support. Also what it does is, because of that base of support, you have a good feel of what's under your foot. So a lot of energy and a lot of feel that's coming back up from the ski, you can get instantly. So you have a better sense of what the ski is doing, right or wrong. The other side of it is, because you have a good base platform, when you buckle the boot, you don't have to buckle your boot as tight. Because you don't have to buckle your boot as tight, there's less chance of cramping and also a better chance of good circulation, because letting the blood flow is really important in skiing. It's wintertime, it's cold, warm feet are key. So one thing you want to make sure is to really get the best chance of an optimal ski boot fit is to try it with a footbed, either something like this that's off the shelf or a custom fitted moldable insole that is done right from scratch for left foot and right foot, depending on what the foot needs. But you always ask the boot fitter, let's talk about footbeds and see what my kind of foot needs.